Welcome to Ethics in the Computer Age, Lecture 1, Part 2. In this lecture, we're going to pick up in part where we left off in an earlier lecture, in Part 1. We're going to start with a more in-depth look at Charles Darwin, and from there we're going to All right, and let's make sure we're actually recording now. Okay, we should be good to go. We said that when Servetus was killed in 1553, it began the breakdown that occurred a century later. If you'll recall, in the lecture, we said Giordano Bruno was killed in 1600, and that between the death of these two men, theoretically, it should have been the end of the ancient world. We said that there were three characteristics of the ancient world. I'll define these terms. Theocracy, all political power is rooted in religion. Think of the divine right of kings. Think of the Pope. So in the ancient world, once it became Christian, if you were a king, you were crowned by the Pope. And if the Pope excommunicated you, you were done. Theonomy. Theology is the queen of the sciences. Theology is the queen of the sciences. Theosophy. Theology is the foundation for all moral reflection. Theology is the foundation for all moral reflection. We said last week that after the death of Bruno, Galileo was arrested and he recanted. He took back everything that he said. We said that when René Descartes learned what happened to Galileo, he burned his theory of everything. And instead wrote the Meditations. And the point that we made about the Meditations was that it effectively put God back in the center of the universe. And the age of denial begins. Denies what? Denies the fact that the ancient world is dead. And this is the point at which Western culture breaks apart at the seams. This is the point at which we intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually remain in the ancient world. Experientially, scientifically, and technologically, we live in another. Okay, are there questions there?
So are you saying that these deaths are the catalysts for us being stuck behind, like you said, I guess
Yep.
mentally? Okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Their fear of death caused us intellectually to fall behind science and technology. So the point I made before this lecture started was that we can't solve the problems that technology causes because they don't exist in the world in which we think. And the point I made was when Apple released the first iPhone, how did Apple not anticipate sexting would occur? Well, first of all, it's possible that Apple didn't care. But I'm more concerned about how the fact that all the parents who bought their kids iPhones never thought about sexting. And that's because sexting is not possible. $400 ago. Make sense?
Quick question. Can you hear
Yeah.
me? All right. Good to be back in your class, Falcon. I just want to say. It's Michael, by the way. I was going to say, is this related to, is this like what Kessler was saying in one of the readings?
Yep.
The darkness in the reading?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Kessler calls it the relative maturity of the masses.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I just want to clarify that. Thank you.
I have another question. I don't want to derail, but why hasn't it kind of balanced itself out after a while? Because in Kessler, he talks about it as if it's a pendulum, right? So why hasn't it kind of evened itself out after a while?
That's a great question.
Catching up, I mean.
That's a great question. I corresponded with Kessler shortly before his death. I think what he would say is that at least in the last 50 years, the pace of technology has increased so rapidly. If you haven't heard of this, you might want to check it out. Moore's Law. Kessler did know about it. And Moore's Law essentially says that the pace of technology will constantly increase. I think if Kessler were alive today, he would be extremely concerned that the pendulum is not swinging back the other way. But great point. Any other questions so far?
Yes, I had one question. Okay, so with your iPhone example, like, wouldn't you be able to say, like, they make the product, but it relies on, like, the people to be responsible with what they do with it?
Well, personally, I think Apple is responsible. And later in the semester, we'll talk about the impact of the end user licensing agreement, the EULA, in which, for example, Apple can say, or Google can say, and you have two choices. You either agree or they shut the device off. So because we don't understand the consequences of being tracked, we don't truly understand what we're doing when we agree to that end user licensing agreement. And what we talked about a half hour before class was the possibility that if we go back to that split intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually versus scientifically, technologically, and experientially, we can't conceive of the problems posed by technology. But two things have also occurred. In science and technology, it's become knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And in business, it's become so later in the semester, when you read about technology and job loss, according to MIT, by 2038, because of smart systems, 80% of the American population will not earn enough money to survive. But we're not asking that question. How do you have a consumer-based economy when no one has money to spend? No one's asking. And because of that, business continues to eliminate jobs in order to get more profit. So everywhere we go, why has sex trafficking become such a problem? Because we don't understand the impact of what's happening on the internet. Any other questions so far before we get back to what we're going to cover today? Everybody good?
I just have one.
Okay, go ahead.
When you say that technology is outpacing humans, but how we're the ones that's making it, how is our own invention outpacing us?
Well, number one, because we don't know what it means to be human, which was part of the function of the first lecture. And two, because of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, we don't ask what the impact of what we're doing is. We don't. I did some research for a paper I was thinking of publishing on sex trafficking. I was so shocked I couldn't finish the paper. There are sites that you can go to where there are very clearly teenage girls essentially, I don't even know how to describe it, performing sexual acts for virtual currency. And not a word has been said about shutting them down. Because part of what's happened we're in an area where there doesn't appear to be any harm, so we look the other way. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
I had a question real quick. Sorry.
Uh-huh.
Having to do with what you were talking about with the sex trafficking, but also with the pendulum. I was just, and maybe you talked about this before, I'm not sure, but did you have just kind of like any ideas or theories about like what if we as a society, just the pendulum that you were talking about, just never ended up coming back and it just ended up going too far one way?
I think we're fast coming to a point where we need to decide what we want the future of the human species to be. Later on in the semester, we'll be talking about Isaac Asimov and the fact that he believed that we could program artificial life forms to be human safe. I don't think that's possible. I think, are you familiar with CRISPR, anyone?
Yeah,
Yes,
so-
oh,
Okay, CRISPR allows me to edit your genes in real time. We live in a society in which people who have money can get anything they want. What happens when they start buying better children? What's the long-term potential effect of that on our society as a whole? We're not asking. For most of us, we can't even conceive of that. So if we're going to get a grip, if we're going to pull the pendulum back, we need to make a fundamental decision about what kind of a world we want to live in 50 years. And we're not doing that. So let's go back and let's fill out what happened a little bit more. At the same time that Descartes is writing in France and in Italy, in England, a largely forgotten man about town, politician, lawyer, mercenary by the name of Edward Herbert is writing a book called De Veritate, which is Latin for concerning the truth. What's particularly interesting is that in a world without a post office, these two guys actually exchanged letters. And Descartes read his book. When you think about no post office and Descartes moved multiple times, how the book ever found him, I don't know. But the importance of what Herbert did was he denied the validity of revelation and systematic theology. This is referred to as an a priori. A priori is Latin for beforehand. Understanding of the world. And what he said was, to know God, look at the world. Why? Because God is the creator. And creation is God's disclosure of itself. Okay, everybody with me?
Yes.
Okay, we're
Yes.
probably gonna have to go more than an hour. But I'm trying to go as quickly as I can without losing you, okay?
Cool.
All right, so this gave rise about 100, this is in 1624. Between 1725 and 1731, two Englishmen who are influenced by him begin to try to figure out if he's right, if Herbert is right, then how do we make moral decisions? Because in an a priori system, you know what's right beforehand. But if you have to look at nature, how do you know? Well, the response was brilliant. The greatest good for the greatest number. And this became a school of thought called utilitarianism. Now, when these guys talked about the greatest good, they mean happiness. How do we make the most people happy? Now, if it stayed that way, we wouldn't be where we are right now. But 100 years, 150 years later, Jeremy Bentham, associated with a school of utilitarianism called hedonistic, changed that to read the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. In fairness to Bentham, Bentham meant intellectual pleasure. But by the end of the 19th century, that is not the way that it is heard. And sure enough, his disciple, John Stuart Mill, would pick that up and he would formulate the principle of harm. The principle of harm says, leave me alone. I am autonomous. Unless I hurt you, unless you hurt me, leave me alone. If I want to smoke, I can smoke. If I want to do drugs, I can do drugs. If I don't want to be vaccinated, I'm not going to get vaccinated. If I don't wear a mask, you can't make me wear a mask. And the only function of government, as I mentioned before class, is redress, fixing harm. And the only real power a government has is to wage war. That's it. So if you think about laissez-faire, hands-off in capitalism, if you think about all the people who don't want to be vaccinated and don't want to wear masks because it's an infringement on their personal liberty, you can thank John Stuart Mill. As long as it doesn't hurt you, I'm going to do what I want to do. Well, in the 1960s, if it feels good, do it. In 1988, Nike's hedonism campaign. Don't even think about whether it feels good or not. Don't worry about the consequences. Don't think about the consequences. The only thing that matters is go ahead and do it now. And you're not responsible if you hurt anybody else. That's their problem. Whatever you want to do it. So if you think about what's happening in American culture at the same time, then plugging my laptop in, battery's getting low. There we go. At the same time this is happening, there's a major shift occurring in American culture. In 1959, one adult could support a family of 5 people. By 1971, 2 adults can have to work to support a family of 4. Why does that occur? It occurs because of technology. We start using technology to get rid of all the low-end jobs. And at the same time, there's a shift to a service-based economy, which is driven by consumerism. Just buy it and buy it and buy it and buy it and keep buying and keep buying and keep buying. Don't think about if you really need it. Don't think about if it's good or not. Just do it. And since the early 1960s, with the invention of the transistor, the pace of technology has far outstripped any other time in human history. And as you'll see in a minute, most of the social problems we now face have their origin in the early 1960s and have continued to grow and will continue to become more and more severe over time. So before we pause for a minute so that I can edit this into 2 parts tomorrow, do you have any questions? Holly Burrows, do I make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Cindy Sandoval, am I making sense? Cindy?
Yes, sorry, can you hear me?
Okay, am I making sense?